Okay, so this week we are resuming the Come Follow Me for Doctrine and Covenants, section 67 through 70, and the subtitle is Stripping Ourselves of Fear and Jealousies. And this subtitle comes from section 67, verse 10, where the Lord is speaking to the elders of the church. So we can turn there. And so this section arises from a situation where the elders were expressing discontent with Joseph Smith and his revelations and the language and manner. And so then the Lord then says, okay, if you have an issue, then appoint someone else to do it. But then he also, appoint someone else to see then whether uh, the person can resemble the tone of Joseph Smith's revelations. In addition to giving this instruction, the Lord gives them some counsel where he reminds them about the privilege and promise that they have as being ordained as elders. And even though this is referring to elders and leaders of the church, this promise, as we'll show and that we'll discuss, is actually applicable to all professed believers in Christ. So, what the Lord says here is, he says, I've given unto a privilege for those who have been ordained to this ministry, that inasmuch as you strip yourselves from jealousies and fears, and humble yourselves before me, for you are not sufficiently humble, the veil shall be rent, and you shall see me and know that I am, not with the carnal, neither natural mind, but with the spiritual. This is a very powerful statement, and I think some of us might overlook what the Lord is saying here. But as I wrote, and as you can see in the bullet point, this is rending the veil. And what that means is this is referring to the experience where the Lord will reveal himself to us. And as I note, this event is a culmination of the gospel. And so while we believe that the gospel is designed to get us to social kingdom and to live with God, which it is, there's a more immediate purpose, which is to remove us from the fallen world, or should I say, to redeem us from the fall and allow us to be brought back into the presence of the Lord. And this is the experience of the brother Jared and many others. And so this is a privilege that is available to all, provided they meet the conditions, of course. And this is one of the purposes of the restored gospel, is to bring back and instill this truth that had been forgotten. And that truth is that we can come into the presence of God while in mortality. And so there are a few sections, and we'll look at those sections when we get to them, but I'm just going to give you an overview where it talks about this idea. Section 84 talks about how the Lord sought to sanctify Israelites to behold his face. And we get that in Exodus 20 and so forth, or Exodus 19 actually, where the Israelites approach Mount Sinai, but then they get scared and only Moses ascends up to the top. But the idea for the Lord is that he wanted all Israelites to ascend to the top of the mountain, but they were scared. And then in section 76, we learn about the vision of Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon, with the Lord telling us at the end that the same things that they saw are available to us, and that we can have the same opportunity. And so this isn't just a knowledge for Joseph Smith, Sidney Rigdon, it's available to all who meet the conditions. And then we also get some teachings from the teachings of the prophet Joseph Smith, where Joseph Smith talks about steps that we are to follow, so to speak. And he talks about a key, and he says the second key is make your calling and election sure. And what is this calling and election? Well, then he goes on to say it's about receiving another comforter. And I'm just paraphrasing. Um, you can pause the video and read this quote if you prefer, but I'm just going to paraphrase. It says, you receive the other comforter. And then he goes, well, what is this other comforter? And it says, is no more nor less than the Lord Jesus Christ himself. And this is the sum and substance of the whole matter. That is, this is the aim of the gospel, that when any man obtains the last comforter, that is Jesus Christ, he will have the personage of Jesus Christ to attend him or appear unto him from time to time. And even he will manifest Father unto him, and they will take up their abode with him, and the visions of heavens will be opened unto him, and the Lord will teach him face to face. Now notice that Joseph Smith does not limit this or use any limiting language to say that only prophets or apostles or church leaders. It says any man, and this is 19th century, so man would refer to women as well. It is not exclusive of gender. And so it's anyone who has met certain conditions will receive Jesus Christ. And the Lord, Joseph Smith goes on and explains in other parts what those conditions are. We don't need to get into it right now because the Lord kind of already tells us in this verse what those conditions are, which are to remove fear and jealousy, right? Because he's telling the elders that they have this privilege, but the problem is that they are caught up in fears and jealousies, and that's what's preventing them from seeing the Lord face to face. So let's understand these terms. Fear, in this sense, is referring to this anxiety, uneasiness, worry, or concern about who we are. And I think anxiety is actually a better term. I didn't put it in this definition here, but I think that captures all these other three terms. And so it's this anxiety about who we are. And then jealousy refers to, envy or resentment towards others based on what they have or what they purportedly have. And so I want to kind of explain how these terms interact and why the Lord would tell the saints that they need to get rid of their fears and jealousies. It's interesting that the Lord says jealousies, not just jealousy, suggesting that there are multiple resentments that we hold to others, and there are multiple things that cause us to resent others, which we'll get into. So to understand this concept, we need to go into some psychological understanding. And this comes from, and I didn't include their names, but these comes from a few authors who have given this framework for how we view the world and our understanding of ourselves as it relates to forming identities. And so one of the things that is interesting is that when we are children, we have this sense of security generally. And I'm speaking for most cases. Some children do not have this luxury and they grow up in abusive homes, and there's further problems that stem from that. But generally, the ideal situation, put it this way, is that a kid in childhood has security of the parents. They don't really have much concern about their identity because as children, they rely on their parents. The parents give them security, and they don't have this concern about who they are. But this changes once we reach adolescence, where we have to start shifting from childhood and childhood mentality and maturity to adolescent maturity. And it's in this shift from childhood to adolescence that we start to realize that we might not be as important as we are, and that we become deeply concerned about our standing in the world, about who we are. And as a result of this, we begin to invent ourselves in order to overcome this anxiety. And I use the word invent because I like it. It's kind of like we're in a lab, so to speak, like creating this identity, and we're using whatever we can to bring this about. And that's kind of like the term, and the authors use this term, and I think it's fitting. And so we create these identities. The problem, though, is that these identities, or these invented identities, are based on falsehoods. And so in adolescence, we might use different metrics to craft this identity, and it might be more than just one. It's not just like being athletic, as I have here, and that's it. It could be a blend of a bunch of things. But we seize on these things to try to create an identity for ourselves, and particularly to create identity that makes us feel that we are valuable, that we have meaning, and that we matter. Because that's deep down the biggest fear of every human being is we might not matter. Especially when we look at the scope of the world and realize really how insignificant we are, that we are just a speck in this entire universe, and that can cause existential angst. And it's in that angst that we create this identity. And so some of these identities in adolescence can be athletic accomplishments, prowess, right? Being the jock, uh, the idea of being a good person, or popularity, right? That's big for a lot of people. They matter because they're popular, because people love them. And now I guess with social media, it's probably even worse. The more likes you get, and I would guarantee you that a lot of teenagers are using those likes to gauge their worth and value. And this is why social media can be very destructive, because teenagers base it on a very superficial measure. But in any case, then you have others. People could be contrarian, like they just want to be difficult and the gadfly just for the sake of it. Not that they're really finding truth; they're just rebellious. You can just say, right? Um, Escapism is another thing, and victimhood, attractiveness. This is obviously something, especially probably teenage girls struggle with the most. Is, are they attractive enough? Because if they're attractive, they're beautiful, and they mean something, right? And so whatever it is, in adolescence, we whether it's one or a hodgepodge, we create this identity for ourselves, but it's false. And this is where suffering arises, because suffering is when these false identities, these inventions, clash with reality. And it causes suffering because we are exposed to who we really are. And reality reminds us that we are possibly insignificant, that we possibly don't matter, that we possibly aren't as great as we thought. Basically, reality just challenges our identity, and it kills it, right? And we cling to our identity. It's almost like a death when we have reality that confronts us, saying and shows us that our identity is false. Now, for some, and these would be considered the humble, they recognize this and say, oh, well, reality is exposing me to the limits of something. I need to change. And so they discard whatever false illusion they've been clinging to, and um, and adjust likewise, right? And you can kind of see this with Nephi, perhaps, where he recognizes that he doesn't know all the things of why his father's doing these things out in the wilderness, and so he goes to the Lord. There's also an argument that this is kind of Abraham, and I've heard some theologians say the reason why God asked Abraham to sacrifice Isaac was because Abraham might have been putting too much um, stock in Isaac, so to speak, because Isaac was the only child he had for, I think it was 90 years is when he had Isaac. But he was really old, and so there could be a tendency where he would rely or place his value on Isaac. And the Lord, perhaps the reason why the Lord wanted or commanded Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, was to jolt Abraham out of that um, temptation to put too much weight on Isaac and his identity on Isaac. Basically, the Lord was causing him to, by putting Isaac on the altar, the Lord was asking Abraham to kill a part of his identity. And I think that's a persuasive view. Might not be right, but it's at least illustrative for this purpose. So that's the humble, and that's the followers of God. Is that whatever when reality exposes them to their false identity, they'll immediately change and have a more accurate honest views of themselves. The problem is that most people don't. And instead, when confronted with that reality, they just cling to their false beliefs. And um, what's important to note as well is that this is referring to adolescence, but eventually these false beliefs, I mean, this carries on to adulthood as well. It's not just adolescence and that's it. These false beliefs carry on into adulthood and they morph and they change. So even though reality exposes us to these things, and maybe we no longer are the jock anymore, or no longer are as attractive because we're getting older, or whatever it may be, we then find new identities to uh, give us that meaning again. And so, with these new identities, we can become multiple things. We can become the devouring mother, right? Instead of being popular among friends, we now want to be liked. We want our kids to like us. And so we kind of play like their friend instead of the parent. And we're scared to discipline them because we're scared that they might not like us. And um, out of that fear, we then end up creating tyrannical kids because they don't have any respect for us because kids don't really respect their friends and so forth. So there's one thing, right? So we shift that popularity, or we live vicariously through our kids. So if we were successful in athletics or at high school, we'll use our kids to do that. We might then focus on fitness, and fitness is great and being healthy, but then it gets to excessive levels of fitness where we won't even fast if it throws off our macros or whatever, or we'll skip. I mean, we'll instead of spending time acquiring light and truth, we're working out constantly, right? It just becomes excessive, and that's all we do. There's careerism, where instead of we shift from academic achievements to careerism, and this isn't always a one-to-one, but this is just some ways to show you how this can shift. We start seeking status, just materialism, finding comfort in material things. The list goes on, and you can look at it. I mean, this isn't exhaustive list, but it's illustrative of how these identities change and how we then, in light of reality and time and growth and aging, we shift to new identities in order to hold on to something. And as the author points out, he says a conventional way to suffer through life is to build a case for ourselves. And what he's getting at here is, when he's saying build a case, is we continue to find ways to support this false identity. And he's saying that's the way we suffer. When we keep trying to build a case for who we are, that's going to lead to suffering. And so how this connects then to the fear and jealousy is this concern, this anxiety about who we are is the fear the Lord is commanding us to be rid of. And this fear causes us to fabricate our identity to feel secure in order to cause us to feel like we matter. And at the same time, as we are trying to craft these identities, we develop jealousy towards people, or resentment towards people who seem to possess the identity that we seek after, or who are standing in the way of us achieving the identity we want. And so that becomes resentment. And with resentment becomes contention. And what you'll find in the scriptures, and at least I'll make the case, is I think most sin is caused by these two emotions, fear and jealousy. So we see this with Esau versus Jacob, and even with Jacob and Esau. I mean, Jacob saw what Esau was the firstborn, he wanted it, and maybe was a little fearful of his standing in front of God, and so he did kind of deceptive things to get the firstborn status, not realizing that God would give to him based on his timing and so forth. But we also got the 12 sons of Jacob, or the 12 sons of Israel, and Joseph, right? They saw Joseph was getting the attention from Jacob, and they wanted to kill him first, and then they sold him. Saul and David. I mean, the list goes on, and it's worth doing scripture study to see how these play out, and how a lot of the contentions and suffering caused on the righteous is really a result of this fear and jealousy by the wicked. And even modern day conflicts, the social unrest the spread of false ideology is rooted in this idea of people resenting the wealthy because the wealthy have something that either they want, they think they deserve, or standing in their way of what they think they get, right? Like the greedy corporations are exploiting the workers, or the greedy corporations are price gouging, and therefore I'm not able to get what I want, even though I haven't really earned the money to pay for it, and so forth. So these things are playing out, and it's all just a cycle, and it's nothing really new, as uh, Solomon or the author of Ecclesiastes writes. There's nothing new under the sun. It all just repeats, and this is probably baked into the um, root of sin in a lot of ways, is these things. So why does God want us then to be rid of these things? Well, obviously because it's a source of problem. But another thing is, and this is what we get from Isaiah, and this is the picture of Isaiah and his experience seeing God, is that standing in the presence of God will reveal who we really are. And God's glory is going to be measured about to the degree by which we view ourselves, right? And so if we are not fully stripped of these things, then we'll be in God's presence and we'll recognize that, and it will cause sheer terror and panic. Isaiah was in such panic, he says he was undone, and um, and that's because he came face to face with the Lord. And now Isaiah's fear was maybe not founded because he doesn't say anything he did wrong. He's just he basically said I was undone because I dwelt with evil people, wicked people, and the angel came to assuage him and reassure him that he can stand in the presence of God, and that guilt can be washed away or purged, which is the symbolic act of the coal to the lips. Um, and we have other accounts as well where people are to standing presence of God, and it's absolute fear and terror. And this also happens with angelical beings as well. So Christ is saying, hey, you have this privilege, but you have to let go of these fears so that you can then stand in my presence. Otherwise, you'll be exposed to exactly who you are. Reality will fully reveal itself to you. And unlike mortality, where reality is coming in doses, when you stand in my presence, it will be a full rush of everything that you won't be able to stand, right? I mean, that's what Alma describes when he's in that state after the angel comes. He has that guilt, and he doesn't want to stand in the presence of God because everything that will be before Alma, because everything is before God. So, anyways, this is what God is trying to do, and I kind of want to go over, now that I've done this more lecture, I want to take remaining time and share my experience to hopefully give you a sense of what it entails. So, my experience, I've gone through this path, and I continued going through cycles of suffering because I had built my life on false identities. And so in high school, one of the ways I found a way to relieve the suffering is I focused on my ability as a swimmer and found that I was pretty good. And so I was able to get through the anxiety or the existential anxiety by focusing on my ability as a swimmer. But eventually, I graduated. I didn't swim in college. And so I had to create a new identity. And it was through that, and I wasn't very, I mean, I went to church, but I wasn't really committed to God, and I fell away. And in light of that, I then got into seeking pleasure as a way to contend with this, I'll call it existential angst. I think that's probably an appropriate way to describe it, or this anxiety, this fear. And then eventually, I, through this, realized the emptiness of the party lifestyle and seeing that it wasn't really doing much for me. I started getting into Eastern philosophy and meditating, and that thing brought meaning to my life. But at the same time, I still was trying to find some meaning for myself. And so eventually I converted back to the church, and um, but and I but I didn't fully give up the fear. I just transferred from something else. So from being caught up in partying, or maybe being more focused on academics, which happened before I converted. But once I converted, I shifted to overdrive and said, okay, this is who I'm going to be. I'm now, um, because I found that once I committed myself and got to studying in college, I found that I could do well in school. And so I built this identity around being smart and intelligent. And I said, oh, well, I do well in school, so I must be smart. And that's who I am. I'm just a smart person. But again, reality exposed itself. And there were experiences where I was shown that I might not be as smart as I thought, that perhaps a exam where I didn't do as well, or paper, or just a class overall. And this created a sense and a kind of a fluctuating experience of joy and happiness, as I would find joy when I did well in school, and I would be sad when I didn't. And it was still in the result of this that I would often compare myself to others, and I would resent others who were doing better than me. And I harbored these feelings because deep down I was trying to overcome this fear. And I had built, and the way I had done this is I had built it off of a false identity, and it's been shifting identities, but now it's finally resting on this idea of, okay, I'm smart. Um, but it led to this fluctuating experience where I would be happy some days, discouraged on others. And whenever I was exposed to any limitations to this belief, to where I might not be as smart as I thought, that caused discouragement, and that caused suffering, and that caused sadness. And I foolishly thought that this is just how things had to be, and that I just had to grin and bear it and so forth. But um, the Lord had other plans. And eventually, I had to come face to face with who I really was, as the Lord, as I felt impressed by the Lord to do law school, and I had to study for the LSAT. And if there's one thing about the LSAT is a pure intelligence test. It is hard logic. It is very difficult. You can't just BS it. This isn't just like an essay where you can wing your way through. And this is understanding the fundamentals of logic, which do not lie. And finally, this was where I was shown my full limitations. And my identity came crashing down as I started studying for the LSAT, and I started doing practice tests and realizing I'm not as smart as I thought. I was really struggling. It was hard for me to get it. My scores were low. And this was the period where I finally was exposed to reality, and where the Lord was showing me that who I thought I was wasn't the case, and I had to let go. And I had to face the fact that I was only capped out at a certain score, and I wasn't going to get the 170 like I wanted, and that I wasn't going to get into a top school like I wanted, because it's just not who I was. That's not my ability, and I had to come face to face with something different. And this was gut wrenching, and it was type of an ego death, and it was the thing though that was keeping me from finding true joy. But eventually, I surrendered to God. I acknowledged that who I was, and I turned to Him to let Him expose me to fully who I was, and to have Him help me to see my limitations. And in doing so, the Lord started to fully show me my false identities and show me what I was clinging to. And it was by doing that that I was able to finally let go of those things, let go of the fear. And as a result of the fear, I let go of jealousy. And in turn, I was able to find the peace and joy. And so at this stage, sorry, the timer ran out. But in any case, it was through that exposure to who I really was, the Lord was able to then help me discard that false belief, to help me gain a more accurate understanding of who I am, and then letting that inform me and letting that um, give me proper perspective. And in so doing, I was able to let go of that false belief, let go of that cycle of suffering, and find joy. And it's crazy because looking looking back, I can't believe I held on to it for so long. But at the time, I was like, "There's no way I can accept that I'm not as smart as I thought. This is everything. This is what I have banked my whole joy on. Like, if this is removed, I'm going to be miserable. I can't live my life if I'm not as smart as I think." But the opposite was true. Is that once I let go of it, then I was able to find joy, because then I was able to understand who I truly was, which was someone being created by God to serve Him in order to provide value to others to bring them unto Him. And that is the purpose for all of us. All of our purpose can be rooted in the fact and extends from God. And it is rooted in the fact that we are servants of God. And this doesn't mean it in a negative way, but it just means that our identity is that, is to serve God, because that is the only, because when we serve God is the only source of joy. When we serve God, we are serving the absolute pinnacle of goodness, and we connect with that goodness, and in so doing we find the joy. And so I just want to leave you with an encouragement that the suffering you are currently facing, and this is particularly for those who feel they're being overcome, that they are continually going through a cycle of suffering where some days are good, some days are bad, and they're using ways to cope, but haven't found this ultimate peace. If you're currently facing that suffering, it's a sign from God that your invented identity is insufficient to sustain you, and that the suffering is exposing you to your limits. It's exposing you to what really is the issue. That obstacle that you are facing is overcoming that is the way to your happiness. And so, what I encourage you to do is to let go of your false identity and trust that God will embrace who you are and will lead to a life of joy. Let me say it again. Encourage you to let go of your false identity and trust God that embracing who you really are will lead to a life of joy. And what I mean by that is let go of your false identity and then embr- trust that God showing you who you really are is going to lead to life of joy.